So with Japan, you're going to see a night and day type of difference. These guys are actually going to be able to successfully reform in the light of Western powers starting to come in and kind of poke them around a little bit. You're going to see that they are going to turn themselves into an empire rather than being turned um, into an empire. What starts here is that Japan was forced to open up to more normal relations with the world by U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. So again, if you remember back to Japan, just like with China, they had sealed themselves off in the Western world, and they were only allowing two ports open to the Dutch, and only the Dutch. Because if you remember, the only thing that the Dutch want to do is trade. They have no interest in bringing in, Christian missionaries. They have no interest in doing anything other than, making a buck. And Japan was pretty stringent with their, closed off policy. If any sailor would be shipwrecked off of their coast and make it to the Japanese shores, they would just simply pitch them back into the ocean. I mean, they were pretty draconian on this. So Perry goes and shows up, and he wants, or the United States wants the Japanese to kind of, chill out a little bit, to open up some more normal relations, mainly because we have a period of empire building, and the United States wants to maybe have the possibility of using Japan's location as an advantage to some future Pacific endeavors. Ultimately, here, what is going to happen is from 1852 to 1900, we have a radical formation of Japanese society. In fact, you want to put down here next to number one, because this is going to be kind of like the whole reason for this section. You want to put down, please, that the policy of westernization, the policy of westernization, and put westernization in quotes. The idea was to westernize. The idea was to westernize or be imperialized. Or be imperialized. So, in other words, when the United States shows up, this is going to kind of be like a holy crap moment for the Japanese. They also know full well what's going on with Japan. I'm sorry, what's going on with China, and they don't want that same thing to happen to them. So, what they figure is that, look, if we rush and we make ourselves as Western as we possibly can, then it's going to be more difficult for these Western powers to come in and do what they're doing to China and do what they're doing to everybody else. So, ultimately, here, Japan is going to become a powerful, modern, united, and industrialized country. It's also going to create its own East Asian empire. Like I said, it's going to end up being an empire unto itself. Now, to give you a little bit of background, because we have talked about this, but just like with China and the Ottoman Empire, it's been a little bit. So, China is under the governance of the Tokugawa shogunate. And these Tokugawa shoguns have ruled since about 1600. And the main task of these shoguns was preventing the civil war amongst rival feudal lords, the daimyos. It was because of the Chinese Civil War that the Tokugawas come in to begin with, and it was because the Europeans were kind of starting to come to Japan and take advantage of the situation during the Civil War, is what caused the Tokugawa shogunate to seal itself off from the Western world. Like, look, if we don't sort of kind of concentrate on our own stuff, these Westerners are going to kind of come in and they're going to constantly be pushing these buttons that is going to cause, potential civil war. Because of what the Tokugawa shogun does, or the Tokugawa shogunate does, Japan enjoys internal peace for about 250 years. Um, you're going to see that a lot of the groups that had been problems before, like the daimyos, are going to be strictly related. Sorry, going to be strictly regulated. There's a very hierarchical society. I mean, Unlike with China, who seals themselves off in the Western world, and it's not going to be a good look for them. For Japan, when they seal themselves off in the Western world, it is going to be a good look. They're going to do a lot that will set themselves up for success here later on when we get to Westernization. There is considerable change in Japan during the Tokugawa period. One, the samurai are going to evolve into a bureaucratic or administrative class, so they're no longer that warrior class or not as much of that warrior class. We have a lot of economic growth, commercialization, and urban development. This is going to be key because the westernization program is going to take a lot of cash. And this westernization program, unlike some of that, half-hearted attempts that the Ottomans do with their westernization, the Japanese westernization program is going to be done with all Japanese money. It's not going to be done with foreign money at all. So you're not going to see foreigners, the Western powers, be able to get influence through the money that they're lending to the Japanese, unlike, like I said earlier, with the Ottomans. By 1750, Japan was perhaps the most urbanized country, and they also have incredibly high literacy rates. 40% of males and 15% of females are going to be able to read. And again, this is going to be at a time period where, we're still looking at female literacy rates in the single digits, and even male literacy rates in 1750, depending on what we're talking about, just breaking double digits at best. Unfortunately, the downside of this is that corruption is going to be widespread. This will be a little bit of a problem. And it's also going to be one of the reasons why the United States is going to be able to come in and kind of muscle their way in a little bit more efficiently than, maybe they could have in some other places. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what's happening here, and by the way, in this section, we're going to have a couple little notes or a bunch of little notes. So just a little bit of a heads up. I'll kind of let you know as we come. So you just might want to start off with going one side, other side, because in this small section we do have, surprisingly quite a bit kind of going on here. So the United States sent Perry in 1853 to demand better treatment for castaways, right to refuel, buy provisions, and the opening of trade ports. Again, like I said earlier, the United States is kind of interested in maybe expanding their influence a little bit, and Japan would really be a great possibility. And in fact, and I mentioned this earlier, but just kind of give it a little bit of context. And I'll put down here next to number one that prior to this, Japan had ports opened only to the Dutch. And then also add to that note that the shogun gave in to Perry's demands. The shogun gave in to Perry's demands. So ultimately, here, Perry just comes in and says, okay, look, this is the stuff that we want. And the shogun, like, Perry doesn't even flex his muscles, doesn't even do anything. And the shogun just simply goes and rolls over. And it's the shogun's spinelessness that ultimately triggers a civil war. The treaty that's going to be signed by the United States and Japan is going to be the Treaty of Kankagawa. And this is going to be uniformly hated by the Japanese and really will be one of the things that causes the Japanese to modernize because it is, the equivalent of their unfair treaty. It's, their equivalent of the Treaty of Nanking that the Chinese had to sign. Ultimately, here, a short while later in 1868, a young group of samurai from the south took over, and they claimed to be restoring a 15-year-old Emperor Meiji to power. Now, at the end of the Civil War, even though it's the Tokugawa shoguns that are in charge, technically the emperor is still around. Um, just a figurehead at this point. But what these young samurai do is that they take this figurehead and they actually go and will put him back into power. Before we get any further, you want to underline here Meiji and then just draw a little arrow. Just draw a little arrow over to the side here. And you just put down means enlightened rule. Means enlightened rule. The aim here is to save Japan from foreigners by transformation of Japanese society rather than by resistance. The Japanese understand that they are going to be outnumbered, outmanned, and outgunned by the United States or anybody else that goes ahead and comes in. So, what they want to do is they want to westernize, they want to transform their society so then it's impossible for other Westerners to come in, and then also so they can rewrite that treaty that they had made with the United States. One of the reasons here why Japan is going to be able to do what it does, and also one of the reasons why, honestly, the United States kind of pokes its head into Japan, is the fact that the West isn't as interested in Japan as it was within China. And the reason for this, I want to put this down here next to number 4, is Japan doesn't have resources the Westerners find desirable. Japan doesn't have resources the Westerners find desirable. So, in order to change Japan, we have to modernize. And again, this is going to be a very unique modernization, very, very much Japanese style. So, you want to put down here next to capital C that Japan learned from the unequal treaties forced on China. Japan learned from the unequal treaties forced on China. The first task here, of course, just like with every place else, is going to be creating a national unity. What happens is that they're going to attack the power and privileges of the daimyo and the samurai. Again, they see that these were the people who betrayed them and signed the treaty with the United States. And because of this, almost all Japanese are going to become legally equal. What also starts to happen, I need you to put this over here on the side, just somewhere you can actually run it down the side. We do have some more notes to add, but you can easily put it over here on the right, and they're not very big. But we have a bunch of reforms going on. I want to give you a list of those reforms that are happening at this point. So you just want to label these reforms Meiji reforms, MEIJI reforms. MEIJI reforms. And we have 5 big ones here. Okay? First one, and I'll kind of explain them as I need to as we go. Land redistribution. Land redistribution. We're going to basically make sure that more people get land. Second, modern military. Modern military. Third, westernize the school system. Westernize the school system. Fourth, a modern banking system. A modern banking system. Now, some of these, before I give you the last one, some of these, they're almost looking at a greatest hits album from the Europeans. Like they look at and they mimic the Europeans that have the best military system, that have the best banking system, that have the best this system or that system. And they cherry pick these reforms to match what European power has the best example of what they're trying to copy. And the last one here, the fifth reform, is emperor worship intensified. Emperor worship intensified. Now, part of that is going to be to create this sense of national unity, that the emperor is this, rallying figure, that type of thing, is also going on here. And in general, especially early on, there's widespread interest in many aspects of the West, from science to hairstyles. In fact, early on, you want to put down here next to number two that there's a manic grabbing. There's a manic grabbing of all things Western. There's a manic grabbing of all things Western. Like if it's Western, the Japanese want to have it. You have official missions being sent to the West, hundreds of students are studying abroad, translation of Western books into Japanese. I mean, you name it, we want it, they got it. Eventually, however, they're going to settle down and make more selective borrowing from the West. And you want to put down here next to number three, you want to put down that they combined foreign and Japanese elements. They combined foreign and Japanese elements. After this period where they're just kind of grabbing everything that's European or everything that's Western, they sort of kind of simmer down a little bit. And what they end up doing is, again, like I said before, they cherry pick the things they want from the places that they think do that the best. And then they'll also incorporate some very quintessential Japanese elements. So you end up getting a little bit of blending going on here. Now, there are some things that are not going to make any headway. One of those Western policies or one of those Western ideas or Western things that don't make any progress is going to be Christianity. Instead, Shintoism is going to be raised to the level of a state cult. So they're kind of, even though they're grabbing a lot of things that are European, they also, or are Western, they're also reinforcing things that are quintessentially Japanese. And Shintoism is one of those things. They do recognize that oppression of the women is going to impede modernization. However, you want to put down here next to number six, but not Western style feminism. But not Western style feminism. Again, there's limits to what the Japanese are willing to do. And while they admit that the overt oppression of women that existed earlier is bad for modernization, they're not going to go full tilt and take on Western ideas of feminism. They do expand universal education, but it will be segregated by sex, and women are prohibited from public life. So, there is a limit to how much the Japanese are willing to do. There's a state guided industrialization program where many state enterprises eventually are going to be sold to private investors. There's some well known names like Kawasaki is going to be one of those businesses that was created by these state enterprises, but eventually is going to be sold to private investors. And the important thing here is that they accomplish modernization without acquiring foreign debt. And it's key to note, you want to put down here next to C underneath number seven, unlike China and the Ottomans. Unlike China and the Ottomans. Again, when Japan becomes isolated and they seal themselves off from the rest of the world, they don't economically stagnate like China does, or it's nowhere near like China does. And, Ottomans, it's a little bit less, but still, both of those places require foreign investment in order to modernize. And it's going to be, like I told you earlier, a way for foreign influence to get in because Japan doesn't have to rely on foreign investment to do this. Foreign influence is not going to come in through those investments, through that cash. Even though all of this sounds fantastic, the reality is that society pays a heavy price. Um, I mean, we have a lot of peasant families are impoverished. Countryside is still suffering infanticide, sale of daughters, and famines. And also, the efforts to organize unions are going to be suppressed. Uh, Two things here in general I need you to put down. And one, the first one you just put down here by 8. Do you want to put that state propaganda? State propaganda supported westernization. State propaganda supported westernization. That's going to be how they're going to get so many people to comply, even though we clearly have, some issues with this westernization. Then you also want to add here next to D underneath 8 that authorities emphasized the theme of service to the state. Authorities emphasized the theme of service to the state and the ideas of enterprise as a family. And the ideas of the enterprise as a family. And again, this is largely going to be done through state propaganda, this concept that this is really a team effort and that everybody needs to pitch in. And yeah, we might have a couple people suffering, but if we all don't do this, then the Western powers are going to come in and we're all going to be suffering. Ultimately, here, this westernization is going to be a colossal success because by the early 20th century, the Western powers readjusted treaties in Japan's favor, which is exactly what they wanted. So, that unfair treaty that Japan had signed with the United States under Admiral Perry is going to be completely and totally rewritten. On top of that, Japan themselves is going to be building an empire. They go to war with China and then with Russia. They're going to gain colonial control of Taiwan and Korea and even want a foothold in Manchuria. So they're actually going to have land on continental Asia. And Japan's rise was widely admired. There was a holy crap, look what these guys were able to do type of vibe going on. In fact, there's even going to be a double holy crap once the Japanese beat the living crap out of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War that ends in 1905. I mean, in fact, there's going to be like some eyebrows raising because of the success of the Japanese. However, Japan's colonial policies were at least as brutal as European ones. I mean, just because these guys worked hard to avoid imperialism doesn't mean that they're going to be nice guys. In fact, I don't think there's anybody that's a nice guy ever within imperialism. Although you do want to put down here next to number 4, it doesn't really matter what side it's on. Do you want to put, please, that later they will portray themselves as the alternative to European imperialism. As the alternative to European imperialism. And we'll see this in the build up to World War II, that they'll actually help to foment rebellious activities within some of these Asian empires, only then to kind of swoop in and replace the Europeans as imperial powers. And they're going to be just as brutal as the Europeans will be or had been.